and walked with gods. And during Saturn's reign, specifically on this earth, it was known as the Golden Age. And that's what you'll hear a lot of people reference back to. And, and you'll hear references to like Atlantis referred to as like existed back in the Golden Age, which if somebody even wants to say if it even existed or not. That's a whole different topic. I just think that's an interesting correlation. But, like I said, he was known as the god of wealth and of agriculture. So a lot of these things are like worshipers of land, of nature. They worship the creation and not the creator. That's the problem. One of many. But anyway, so that is pretty much that. And Saturnalia also, with the winter solstice actually takes place on the longest night of winter. That's when we have the least daylight. And it usually falls between December 21st or the 23rd. One of those 3 days is usually when your winter solstice falls on, just depending on, your calendar year and everything of that nature. So that's an interesting correlation there. Just what all these people do. It's these traditions. Well, not so much. The originators of these traditions. They're not workers of good, so they do these their deeds in the cloak of darkness. So it's interesting that the winter solstice is always celebrated the most and was revered the most by all the people at that time, and it was held on the longest night of the year. So it ties a lot in to just so much. Just the date of December 25th is shared with Mithra and the Mithra festivals, who was supposedly born on that day, and he was a sun god, and this kind of ties into basically sun god worship on December 25th and that's why people try to tell you that that's when Jesus' birth was December 25th, because he was the Son of God. But SON, not but these guys are used to worshiping their sun god SUN on that day. And it's interesting, all your pastors who are straight up, well, they'll let you know that, well, that's not really when Jesus was born. Couldn't have been born on December 25th. It just doesn't line up biblically with everything that was going on with the shepherds. And there would be no shepherds outside to see the star, because it was too cold then for their sheep and their flocks to be out. It was just the times of year doesn't match up with scripture for Jesus to be born on the 25th. But it's interesting that they'll kind of tie him in to that day. And I think a lot of that just comes from Constantine. And Constantine, he basically he took over a lot of Europe, I believe. And with that, with his new conquering land that he had just took over through great wars and battles, half of his population were Christian and half of his population was pagan. And so if you're a ruler, over a great divide amongst such a great land and a great amount of people, well, what do you do to keep from having an uprising? Because you don't want one group getting mad at the other, and then they're going to eventually get mad at you for not doing something about it. People are the same way with politics today. They get mad at the president for not fixing this or fixing that, when ultimately, he's just a fall guy. But that's just a different story in itself. So at that time, when the rulers had more more pull on what was going on. That's when he decided to try to merge the two religions, because before then, Christianity, they were just basically still carrying on the feasts of the Lord, which is talked about, being like Passover and Sukkot and all of those, even after Jesus' death. They never celebrated his birth. They just celebrated all of the traditions that were established from the beginning, and with God. But yet they were able to see how Yeshua had fulfilled so many of them, and we're still waiting on him to fulfill a lot of the fall feasts, which will have to do with his return. But the more you learn about that, the more you know about that, it becomes exciting. And I'm not going to really, it's not my intent to touch on a lot of those topics, but just to kind of shed light that, that's what all of the disciples and everyone carried on in Christianity, was to celebrate those traditions. And then whenever Constantine come in, he kind of tried to combine the two and took away the traditions of a lot of modern Christians and had them, compromise them, just to try to make everybody happy. And you see that kind of going on today. And I mean, I understand why he did it, but I don't agree with it, but just because he didn't want to have half of his population pissed off at him and ready to overthrow him, basically. So, yeah, I get it. But like I said, it's not like I agree with it. I just understand why he did it. So, and it's from that is the roots and traditions of that, is where we have pretty much come into today, and we've kept these same traditions without knowing it. Like worshippers of Nimrod, who became the sun god of Baal, and his wife Semiramis and his child Tammuz. These things all played in on Constantine, and just, Christmas and Easter. Constantine was just trying to avoid a civil war, and, so that, and, another thing that he did was he changed the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday, and Sunday is actually, for sun god worship. That's where the sun part comes from. Sunday is sun god worship. And even Saturday, though, is named after Saturn Day. So all your days of the week, folks, are originate from these things, and it truly is a fallen world that we live in today. And the more you see it, and the more you kind of look into these things, you really realize what a fallen world we do live in. And so it's interesting, and what is it? Constantine made the winter solstice. He moved it from December 20. Well, he didn't move it, but it was basically, like I said, from December 21st to the 23rd, and just extended it through the 25th. And that's when they would celebrate Tammuz, the return of the sun god to Earth, and which would basically lead to the spring equinox, which is where, that's why Easter is always in the spring. Because it falls onto the spring equinox, which is the celebration of Semiramis, the fertility goddess, coming back to Earth in a large egg, and beside the river Euphrates, and she would come back in this egg, and then she would emerge from it and change the first bird she sees into an egg-laying rabbit. All right, so that's where we get the Easter bunny from. Interesting enough, because it took me a little bit of digging to find where the rabbit comes from, but it really ties into the rabbit being the sign of fertility, just back from ancient days. And so yeah, that's That's that. That's where your rabbit comes from. But Semiramis is known as many things. She's known as Ishtar, and just she goes by so many different names, and you know, and and the spring equinox was also commemorated by the temple prostitutes, virgins, basically virgins, not so much the temple prostitutes, but like virgins who were basically given for this ritual, and they would have basically intercourse with the priests of the temples, and then the following year they would have 3 month old babies, and they were given in the sacrifice the following spring equinox to the goddess Ishtar, and the blood of these babies would be used to dye the eggs that were offered up to the altar for this goddess. And that's where we get the tradition of dyeing Easter eggs. It's you're dyeing these eggs in the blood. They would dye eggs in the blood of 3 month old babies, and that's it's an awful thing to even think about, but that's what it was. And another thing is, how Tammuz ties into a lot of this is what? Because he was yeah, Tammuz was the son of Semiramis, who is actually also known as Ishtar, and he was also known as a deity who was related to agriculture and just to the worship of nature in Babylonian times and the flocks, and he was personified with the creative powers of spring. So that's another thing why he was also recognized in the spring equinoxes, and how he kind of ties into a little bit of Easter. So let's dig into Easter a little bit more. The term Easter is also another form of Ashtart, one of the titles of the Chaldean goddess, the Queen of Heaven. And, like I said, Ishtar is the mythology of the chief Babylonian and Assyrian goddess associated with love and fertility, and also one of war. Being the counterpart to Ashtart. So that name is crazy, but yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. And the term Easter was also derived from the Anglo-Saxon Ishtar, the name given, of the goddess of spring, and the whole equinox there. So we're really beginning to see where a lot of things with Easter, with the rabbit and the dyeing of eggs, and a lot of these things happen to come from. And the real worship of these entities, Estro, Ishtar, Ashtar, they all were come to the North American through the ancient through the British Isles and the ancient Druid traditions, and they brought it over to the states here, and helped carry on the merger of also the spring festivals, like when Constantine basically he took Passover and blended the spring equinox with it, and it's crazy, but that's pretty much where it all kind of comes from. It it's a lot to take in, and there's no doubt about that. It is a lot to take in, and but it's another thing I hear too. It's like I'm not, like I said earlier, I'm not here to condemn anybody for celebrating Easter and Christmas, because they're like, well, it doesn't matter what it meant today.